Addictions can take over your life, become what you live for, and rob you and those who love you of hope that things can be different. But things can be different, and there's reason to feel hopeful. We're going to help you find that hope tonight. We're talking about recovery from addictions next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. With denial so much a part of the addicted mind, it's really hard for people to know when they need help. And for some who've been through treatment again and again, only to find themselves back living in addiction instead of living in recovery, it can be hard to believe, well, that you're even helpable. So let's first put that to rest. There is reason to feel hopeful, no matter what your situation is. And I have two guests who are going to help us explore this idea of recovery from addictions. One who will share her own story of hope and recovery. So let's get busy. Call in your questions now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. Joining me is Julie Seitz, Clinical Director at the Center for Alcohol and Drug Treatment, and Jill Petzel is the Executive Director of Minnesota Recovery Connection. She herself is living in recovery, having not used alcohol for the last 5 years. And first of all, I want to say, Jill, congratulations on that. And I know that you said that your 6th anniversary is coming up.
Coming up next month.
Coming up next month,
Yep.
So much congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I think a really great place to start, Julie, would be before we sort of get into what recovery is, what recovery looks like, is kind of what I would call Addictions 101. What do we need to know about addictions?
So when we think about addictions, I like to kind of break it down to the ABCs. And really what that's about is the inability to abstain. There's behaviors that start to interfere with significant life areas, cravings, emotional dysfunction. And so it's a complex brain disease that often is not as easy as just not using.
And so that old Nancy Reagan, just say no,
right,
is really not a strategy that we think is going to be effective for most people then.
For most people, no.
And that really oversimplifies and makes it sound like it's just a bad habit that you've gotten into, and rather than the illness really that addictions become.
Right, right.
And so, Jill, I want that's sort of the clinical version of this. And I mentioned in the beginning, and I think one of the D's is kind of denial of the ABCs, and the D might be denial.
Right.
And so I think maybe a nice place for us to start with you is, how did you even know that you had a problem? How did you come to know that? Because I know that part is so different for different people.
Right, and it really is difficult. And one of the things that also, in thinking about Addiction 101, it is not a moral failing. The folks that are in an addictive pattern really are not making good decisions because they really can't. It's not an excuse, it's just the reality. I knew I was starting to have a problem. I was a binge drinker, I was a social drinker, and so I would usually drink once a week, maybe twice a week. But during that time frame, it was never, it wasn't one drink, it was as many as you can fit in that evening. And things started spiraling out of control from behaviors and things that I was using at work, within my social life, within my marriage at that time. So, I knew probably a year before I went to treatment that I had a problem. I had kind of a major accident as a result of drinking. And then my last episode of drinking was one of the worst nights of my life. And I realized the next morning that I didn't want to do this anymore. I didn't want to be hungover. I didn't want to have to go back and say I'm sorry to a lot of different people. I didn't want to live my life that way anymore. And that's when I went for help.
And I think she brings up a really great point, if I may. There's so many folks that are living in addiction, are in a cycle of not wanting to do something that they continue to do. And you bring up a really great point that it's not a moral failure. And so, you know, thinking about like how the substances that we use affect our prefrontal cortex and how our impulse control gets changed. And so it's not always going to be, it's not choosing drinking or drugs over family or their loved ones. It really becomes, you know, a spiral.
And I love what you just said, Julie, like this having a sense that I don't want to be doing this, and maybe making promises to yourself then that I'm not going to do this. And all you do is you create this cycle of failure, which further lowers your self-esteem.
Absolutely.
Which further then I now have to use to cope with myself that I don't like, to be able to stand myself. And it's amazing, when I think about all of that, I feel like it's amazing that anybody even goes to seek help. So whereas I think a lot of people are you know, become entrenched in this, well, some people get help and then all they do is relapse back. And I'm amazed that people even have the courage to walk in the door.
Right. Well, and one of the things is that there are many pathways to recovery. I chose treatment, and I did outpatient treatment. Many others do just stop, and they find a way to white knuckle their way through life until they get to a point where they're past withdrawal. They've been able to find emotional things to help them. They might have a spiritual program they use through their faith-based community. So people use all different pathways to recovery. Mine was treatment. The majority of folks don't necessarily use treatment as that pathway.
True.
And so maybe now we've moved into talking about recovery, and we want to spend most of our time talking about recovery. Let's talk about even what a definition of recovery would be.
Well, and it's holistic. I mean, I think, Jill, you were touching on it. There's many different pathways, so there's this holistic approach and definition of it, that it includes mind, body, spirit, it's home, it's community, it's finding a higher level of functioning, a better way of life.
And I think, you know, my whole definition of recovery has changed as a result of my work now at the Minnesota Recovery Connection. So one of the things that I used to think was abstinence was recovery. That was just it. But actually, reduction of use, improved health outcomes, decreased use of emergency department or detox, those are all pathways of recovery that someone has started and initiated a process to help themselves improve, you know, their lives. So abstinence isn't the only definition of recovery.
I think that's a great point.
And I think, you know, a lot of people think of recovery or treatment even, so let's talk even about that, about what treatment looks like. I think there are a lot of viewers out there who think it's the 28 days and done. And so last week, if you were with us last week when we were talking about how to talk with your kids about sex, we said there's no more one and done conversations. This is an ongoing conversations. And I kind of feel like this concept of 28 days and done is maybe a little oversimplified and not what the picture really looks like.
Well, I think it's greatly,
it's way
greatly
oversimplified.
And you know, what we know is that treatment works, and at various levels of care. So whether that's an inpatient or an outpatient, or even a therapy level of care, but it works at varied lengths. There is no one size fits all, and it often takes years for people to develop addiction. It often takes people years to develop recovery.
And one of the things I would add to that is that part of the challenge with addiction is that it's treated as an acute illness. You go to treatment, okay, now you're cured, and that's not the case.
This is not hip replacement.
Right, this is not hip replacement. This is a chronic disease that needs aftercare, that needs a continuum of care. And Minnesota is really working towards this recovery-oriented system of care in which there are more peer-based approaches to helping people, you know, after treatment and long after treatment, so that it helps people continue to have good health outcomes, better behaviors, better emotional health as a result of those supports.
So let's talk a little bit about what the important elements are for people in recovery. And I think in part, you know, when I think about that, some of what I think that we need a good understanding is where people, what are some of the challenges that they bring into treatment based on what their addictions have been, because that's going to tell some of the story about what their needs are. for recovery to be a successful change for them, whatever that might look like?
Well, that can be very complex. And so, you know, when we start looking at the complexities in which people come to treatment with, we really want to, the first thing that has to be addressed is the acuity of their withdrawal and their physical health. And that's typically the first thing that we're always assessing. And then from there, it's really evaluating, you know, you and I have said many times, it's the recovery environment that they're living in. You know, people don't recover if they're it's hard to recover if you're homeless and you don't have a supportive recovering environment, right? So looking at those.
You know, it was funny because in treatment, and I went to a 12-step treatment program, and one of the things they talked about is that your behavior and maturity level sort of stops when you start using. So the younger you are when you start using, the more maturity and sort of work that you need to do to sort of catch back up to where you are. And I can honestly tell you that the first couple of years of recovery are really tough because I was still that eighth grade girl that was, you know, having temper tantrums and not understanding why everyone was out to get me. And it takes, that's this whole idea of a continuum. It takes a long time to start feeling better.
And I want to go back to
so many ways.
That concept of being the eighth grade girl, which is one thing when you are an eighth grade girl, and it's completely different if you're 45 and you're the eighth grade girl. Right?
Exactly.
Because you have life tasks to do that don't match the eighth grade girl's knowledge level and skill level of how to negotiate responsibilities. And relationships.
Right, right. And so, you know, folks that I've talked that have been in longer term recovery have talked about the fact that, you know, at the 6th year, the 7th year, even into the 8th year, you're really starting to emotionally be catching up with your age. And it is life-changing. So there's that hope, you know, right when you get out of treatment, you think, oh, I'm all done, I'm better. And then you realize that life starts coming at you again, and now you don't have this crutch anymore. And so you have to find other ways to be able to manage those stress levels and provide self-care. A lot of us don't know how to take care of ourselves. We spend too much time, you know, doing care of others. Even that's a codependency for women, tends to be another issue for alcoholism. So anyway, to make a long story short, this is the reason why it's a chronic illness. You know, like diabetes, like other things, it just needs to be treated on an ongoing basis and paid attention to.
Let's talk about the importance of your sort of support network in recovery, and I think this is so important. In the area of addictions, where it is not just, and we say this is true for all mental illnesses as well. It's not just the person, it's the family, it's the people who love and care about you. But oftentimes what we're seeing is families are pretty alienated. On the one hand, they're that combination of sort of alienation and over-enmeshment, over-involvement, where families are behaving like case managers. Instead of, so talk a little bit about what are some families' needs in recovery.
You know, it's a question we get on a really frequent basis, and the family's needs. I mean, they have, you know, the window of opportunity to when their loved one, their addicted loved one, is willing or able to seek help is really quite small, and so they need ready access to treatment services or support services or intervention services, and they need some education on what addiction is and how it affects. Well, they know how it's affecting them, but like what their role is and what their role maybe isn't in this, including self-care, like you were talking about, family self-care.
Well, and one of the things that we talk about is that recovery is for the whole family. So the entire unit of the family has been impacted. So children may be dealing with trauma, for example. You know, spouses, from sometimes codependency becomes a major issue for the partner in the family. So one of the things we really encourage people to take a look at is not only is the person that's in recovery getting treatment or doing what they need to do to maintain their recovery, the family also needs help in looking at how to let go of some of that trauma, or dealing with the trauma, but then also letting go of some of those codependent sort of behaviors. So Al-Anon is one group that helps resource that helps the family members of folks who are in addiction. But we do talk a lot about the fact that it is a holistic approach to recovery, that the whole family needs to be involved.
And I think part of that too is just getting used to, if you're a spouse of someone who is addicted, getting used to living with that person sober.
Yeah.
Because you may not, as dysfunctional as it may have been to live with the addicted person, it is also what you know, and it is what you've come to know, and it is what is easiest for you to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's one of the challenges of recovery, is trying to figure out how to socially connect with people again and be in relationship without being the eighth grade girl and doing that. So, that's all part of the challenge of sort of undoing some of the messes that you've created, but also learning how to be part of that family again.
So, Julie, here is a question from a man in Chisholm who asks, is there medication that helps with addictions, or is it mainly talk therapy?
It's research shows that it's a combination of both that tends to be most effective. So there are several medications used to help with addictions. With opiate dependence, there's Suboxone and Subutex, which is a buprenorphine, and there's methadone, which is another commonly used and very effective medication used for opiate addiction. And then for alcohol cravings, there's a medication called naltrexone or Comprasate. So we often are talking about the combination of pharmacotherapies with talk therapy, and that's where research is showing it's really most effective.
And we certainly know that if you have a co-occurring disorder, if you have an underlying depression, that sometimes you're getting medication for that other illness. Especially what we see is when addictions have sort of started out of this source of self-medicating whatever mental illness has existed there, either a bipolar disorder or a schizophrenia or depression or anxiety. The top four probably is what you're going to see from a co-occurring disorders.
Absolutely. And the use of medication for treatment has been somewhat of a controversial topic among the field.
I was just going to say, let's talk about that.
So there's a lot of discussion about
and what you mean by that, so that the audience, like the three of us, know what Jill's talking about. But for you, who may be wondering, well, what is Jill talking about here? Is that there are some people who believe that if you are going to become sober from substances, then you cannot use medication in order to do that, and you cannot use medication to treat your mental illness. And I obviously am not going to share that point of view.
Likewise. There is decades of research that show that medicines used to treat and help people recover from addiction is really effective.
And what we would say is that if you have an underlying problem also that needs to be treated, and you're not treating that adequately, your chances of living the kind of recovery that you want to live go down.
Well, and we wouldn't deny a diabetic insulin. We wouldn't deny someone with heart conditions the medicines they need for hypertension, those kinds of things. So to treat addiction with a medicine is like any other chronic illness. So once again, it's just changing that. There's a lot of stigma around addiction still. And a lot of misunderstanding, even within people in recovery.
Absolutely.
So we have to start, as people in recovery, begin to advocate for others who may need a different pathway, for long-term recovery and better outcomes.
Let's talk about the relationship between relapse and recovery. Because I think this sort of in some ways goes back to the 28 days and done conversation that I just have to want to be sober and I can get to, the problem is I haven't wanted it badly enough, or now somebody can teach me how to do this, and so I can come to your place and in 28 days I will never I can learn something in 28 days and then I can execute it perfectly, like everything else we learn newly in our life, right?
Right.
So, there's some language out there that relapse is a part of recovery, and I think, I just as a play on words, I think relapse is something that is likely. And what I mean by that is, and no matter how we identify it or talk about it, it's to the person experiencing relapse, it feels like failure. And so it feels like all the work that's been put into their recovery at this point is failure. But it is when we talked about the definition of recovery and the changing, it's reducing the amount and the impact that those use episodes have. It's reducing the consequences of using. So when we talk about relapse, although some people don't experience a relapse, but in the event that a relapse does occur, I think it's really important that people understand it's not failure.
Right. One of the things, it's once again, one of the people Julie works with, Gary Olson, has talked about the fact that, relapse is, to say, take 6 years and let's say I were to drink again, suddenly some folks would think, well, those 6 years are down the drain, so you start all over again. Others would say, no, that relapse was only just another part of that journey. You still started the 6 years ago by taking the initiative, and look at where your life has come. That doesn't all go away because of one moment in time.
Agreed.
And so when I am in the meetings with folks and they talk about those relapses, I really try to look at them and say, don't feel guilty, don't be ashamed, this is your journey. It's part of that.
Because you
and
don't
accept
forget,
it.
it's not like you're going to forget everything that you did
No,
learn in those
exactly.
6 years. You
Absolutely.
are not the same person that you
Absolutely.
were back then.
Absolutely. And there are people that might go back and use for a year before they go back to that place. But, again, that's their journey. That's part of what they're having to go through. And you read story after story of folks who've been in long-term recovery, and that happens. There are people who've been in recovery for 25 years that have relapse. It happens. And so it's part of that story of just, this is part of my journey.
And I do like that notion that there is nothing in life that we do perfectly. So
Right.
why on earth would we be? Why would
Exactly.
this
Why
be the
expect it?
Exactly.
one thing
Right.
that human beings should be expected to do perfectly?
Right. Yeah, and to be fair, to some of the folks in recovery who might feel very differently about that and feel that's very sacrosanct
right.
about, that once you relapse, it is about starting over. I respect that. My opinion is very different in that it just doesn't do folks good to feel shamed.
Agreed, and I think you're emphasizing that it's just the many pathways to recovery.
Yep.
I mean, some people really find and embrace an abstinence-based recovery with no relapses, and
Right.
we support that and think that's fantastic. But it's also about understanding and appreciating everybody's journey is different.
Well, and that notion that there may be many different paths and one true path for you.
Right.
And
exactly.
so that one true path for you, for the person who has to have absolute abstinence and who functions within that belief system and everything that comes with it, that is
Absolutely.
going to be their miracle.
Absolutely.
That is their hope. That is their miracle. And it may not be my miracle or your miracle or your miracle.
Right.
Well, and that's part of the expectations, right? That come with what
Absolutely.
recovery is. And so if we can help people understand that recovery is a little bit more holistic and individualized, then the expectation may not have such a negative connotation.
And I think the more that people like me who are in recovery start talking about their own experience in that journey, and we start sharing our stories with other folks, that's our opportunity to really begin to end some of the stigma and some of the thinking around addiction and what recovery is all about, to just educate people about what this process looks like.
Now, we are drawing to an end, and what, Jill, would you say as a message of hope to people who are out there listening? And we got a lot of calls, and a lot of them were about very specific things about becoming unaddicted. And what do you want to say as a message of hope to those people?
I would say that the first step is admitting that you have a problem and being able to take that step to say, and in AA, it's to admit you're powerless over alcohol and that your life has become unmanageable. once you take that step and you start looking for help, that's the first piece. And there's great hope, and there is life outside of drinking or using drugs, and you can be happy and you can enjoy those friendships and everything in a way that you probably would have never imagined.
Right. Social connectedness. I mean, that's really what the message is. I think that we're hearing all of the time, right? Social connectedness is so important, and there is always hope, even if your story thus far does not seem like a story of hope for you. Don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links and read my blog, which I haven't been writing. Oh, that's my bad. But I'm going to do a mashup of the last few episodes that we've had. I have a lot of questions here to answer. That will be happening next week. It's the place where I answer all of these questions. You'll want to join us next Thursday when we share the inspiring story of an Emmy Award-winning TV meteorologist diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.